Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe, and good morning to our viewers here in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I am delighted to be joined by New York Times reporter Christopher Schuetze. He's been reporting on right-wing populist movements in Europe and is based in Berlin. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it seems like for once, the polls leading up to the European Union's parliamentary election over this past weekend were pretty accurate across Europe. We saw a surge in support for far-right parties and a real backlash against governing centrist parties, especially in countries like France and Germany. Let's maybe start by talking a little bit about what your readout is from the European parliamentary election over the weekend. Why do you think the far right did so well?
I think there's sort of two parts to this answer. One is looking at Europe, which is not really my area of expertise, and the other one is looking at Germany. I will, say about Europe, I think there's sort of a shift in the West towards populism, towards easy answers, towards probably filter bubbles where people sort of find their kind online, and a shift away from this sort of like this wish to have democratic governments in place. I think that can be seen as like just a criticism of how things are going. People are not very happy with the state of things. And I think that can also be seen on other levels of the success these parties are having, addressing this. In Germany, it's clearly the case that the AfD has been effective in sort of its campaigns. It's actually, interestingly enough, also speaking to young people. They have a very good TikTok presence, which to me is always crazy when you see these AfD parliamentarians who are mostly older white guys, and then but all of a sudden they have just these incredible TikTok followings. And I think there's in Germany also this idea that the mainstream parties kind of fell asleep at the wheel in some ways, that they didn't realize that this was coming or that it would be so bad. Having said this, I think Germany actually, 16% of far right who vote for the AfD on Sunday is scary, but it's not nearly as bad as we feared 5-6 months ago. And when you compare it to other places in Europe, it's actually sort of moderate.
So I'm happy that you brought up this last point about it. It could have been worse, because I do think that it's interesting to look at some of the developments that have occurred earlier in this year, starting with Correctives reporting on a secret meeting just outside of Potsdam of the AfD. That reporting, of course, led to lots of reporting in Germany, but also lots of international reporting about what the AfD had planned and some of its policy prescriptions when it comes to migration. But it led to a real backlash, a number of anti-AfD protests in cities across Germany. Do you think that sort of dampened the popularity of the AfD, and that's part of the reason why they only came out with about 16% nationally?
We actually looked at this, and there's, as you know, several scandals. We can talk about the other ones, but from what I heard from people we spoke with within the party, that was probably the biggest factor, were these big demonstrations against the AfD that came in the wake of this reporting. It wasn't so much the reporting itself. Within the party, there were a lot of people that kind of felt like, well, that, of course we're talking about this, it wasn't a secret meeting, it was totally open. But I think the AfD has its core, its base voters of, let's say, 10%. And what had happened over the last year or year and a half was that people who previously always said we would never vote for AfD, they started losing their fear of the party. At the same time, there was a lot of criticism of the mainstream parties, and a lot of those people came over to the AfD and said, okay, I would vote for the AfD, even though I used to say I would never do it. I would. And then what happened when they saw the demonstrations, those were the voters that then said, maybe not. Maybe these guys are too extreme. If we have millions of Germans marching against, and it wasn't just people in Berlin and Hamburg and Munich, it was people in smaller villages. I mean, there was really sort of this huge mass movement of pro-democracy protesters. And I do think they scared some of the potential voters away. Yeah.
And how do you account for the regional differences, right? The national results of the AfD were at about 16%, but there were other results that were reported on comparing Eastern Germany and Western Germany. In the Eastern Länder, they had upwards of 26% of the vote. They've been polling at much higher levels in the 30 to 40% range. Can you talk a little bit about why the messaging of the AfD resonates so much in the East?
I mean, I think, we spend a lot of time thinking about this, but I think that the main reason is that the East has also already gone through one political change. They've changed from one regime to the other, so they might be less fearful of a new change into this new right-wing regime. I think where for years where West Germans were always said anything approaching Nazi would never vote for them. In the East, there was only one party. There wasn't a big discussion about potentially voting a neo-Nazi party, and so people aren't as trained in this sort of idea that it's not that I won't say that Easterners didn't know about fascism and all this stuff. They did know about that, but just this idea of there are these different parties and they're potentially far right parties and so forth. But I do think, and I do spend time in the East, people are unhappy. They're quite worried about their future. And what they did 35 years ago when they were unhappy and they were worried about the future, they went on the street, they voted for another system eventually. And I think there are people now who can imagine the same. And those are the people who also I should just notice, I mean, so an interesting thing is because for years they were also fed by the state sort of propaganda, there are certain things you can say and so forth. They are also much more likely then to think that what is like mainstream media, that is propaganda, that's not true, that certain of these scandals we'll talk about with the EU candidates, for example, that's simply not true, that is totally invented. Whereas I think in the West, there's more of a sort of, well, we'll trust what the mainstream media tells us.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one more question sort of about these results and about something that you brought up a little bit earlier about how the AfD has been particularly effective in its campaigning to younger people. This, of course, was the first time that 16 to 18-year-olds were able to vote in Germany, not everywhere in Europe, but certainly in Germany. And I think that there was some surprise that this group, which traditionally has been a group that supported the Green Party or more left progressive movements, actually some of them gravitated to the AfD as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, obviously the AfD had sort of an effective campaign, but was it also the contents of the messages that appealed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that surprising, and in a weird way, I actually think it's encouraging that the kids are voting at all, that the voting participation was high, even if they vote for the AfD. But I think there are a lot of very right-wing kids because they're brought up in those families. I mean, we've had these stories about in the East, these schools where the kids were, saying Heil Hitler to each other, and that was sort of like the norm. So I don't think this idea that we had once upon a time that kids were always by nature progressive, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think young kids in the East, especially in the countryside, who might feel disadvantaged, could also be hoping for a different system. That doesn't surprise me. And then when you add to that this massive online presence that really the far right has done much better than any of the other mainstream parties, it kind of makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. I have a colleague at the moment who's traveling in in Eastern Germany with a delegation focused on issues around social cohesion, and she was just in Erfurt and said that yesterday each of the meetings that the group had sort of started with questions around what happens if the AfD makes it into government, and how will that sort of change things. And I thought, given that you've reported from the Netherlands as well, there was just the news today that political parties in the Netherlands have reached a final agreement on the formation of a right-wing government, led by Geert Wilders. So we're sort of seeing that in action in another Northern European country. To what degree do you think people in Germany are really afraid of the AfD being in a government position, in a government role, more actively than they are already on the local level?
I think that does exist in states like Thuringia, and also Saxony, where there's a real fear that they could come into the government. There's one big difference between the Netherlands. I mean, there are many, many differences between the Netherlands, but in this question, the difference is that the mainstream parties have all vowed not to work with the AfD,
Mm-hmm.
which is not such a simple thing, because on the one hand, that means that what's happening now in the Netherlands would not happen in Germany. You wouldn't have a coalition, and even in their wildest dreams, they're not going to get 51%, even in those state houses. But the problem is that the people who vote for the AfD can then legitimately say, well, see, we're not being represented. If nobody's willing to work with us, this is exactly, this is sort of like another argument against the political system, that there are parties that just won't work with us, even though 30% of us or whatever vote for them. So it's a big problem. But on the other hand, I think what we see in the Netherlands is not something that we're likely to see in Germany in the coming decade or so,
Mm-hmm.
because, the conservatives, everybody sort of agreed we're not going to work with them. And so the only way they could actually come into power in Thuringia, say, is if they actually got half or more of the votes.
Mm-hmm. So against this sort of backdrop of the EU election and how well the AfD fared in this election, the real reason why I wanted to talk to you today was to talk about these legal cases against the Reichsbürger, because that's been something that has been really kind of bubbling up over the last few weeks. The Reichsbürger, of course, are so-called citizens of the Reich, a very disparate group that basically denies the legitimacy of the modern German state, and is parked very firmly on the far right. And last month, one of the largest legal proceedings in German history started with the first trials against the Reichsbürger, who had planned a violent overthrow of the Bundestag. And this was then followed by some raids last week, when some 700 police officers in 3 different states were following up on this and trying to find information related to the attempt to overthrow the system. And so I really kind of wanted to talk to you to kind of unpack what's going on with the Reichsbürger, and what's going on with these cases, because it's very, very complex, with, I guess, 27 individuals who are being tried in 3 different cases in 3 different cities because of the complexity, and because of security concerns. So do you want to sort of bring us up to speed on how we should parse and understand these cases and what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to sort of call back into mind what happened in 2021 in December, and we got this spectacular news that all these people were arrested who were planning to overthrow the German government. And that's already serious news. But then when you heard that there was a lot of weapons involved, that a lot of these players were soldiers, and some of them were actually elite soldiers, kind of like the like the Navy SEAL type equivalent in the German army. Um, and they were sort of assembled around this Prince Royce, who who was sort of supposed to be the chancellor once they overthrew the government. So that came just out of absolutely nowhere, and we had some time to digest it. And now, a year and a half later, wait a minute, is it 2020? I think it was 21 December. So now the public prosecutors have had time to make their investigations to actually indict, to bring their cases, and they have in one of the cases like a 780-page indictment, of which they read us 60 pages in court. And so this huge, messy kind of structure. And it's really interesting because I've now been to the opening session of each one. So next week on Tuesday, I'll be at the opening session of the Munich trial. They've already been two other trials that have started. And so you get to see these people again after they've been in jail for a while. It's really interesting because it's a bunch of sort of older guys who, some of them were trained, very smart people, some of them very established in society, and somehow through this sort of unholy mix of hating the government, getting in on the pandemic protests. There were big like protests against all the restrictions in Germany. Some of them just plain old Nazis. They came up with this idea to overthrow the government. Now, as sort of well organized as the idea to overthrow the government was, they had cabinet meetings. I mean, first of all, they had a cabinet. They'd already designated people to be ministers in this shadow cabinet. They had a chancellor. They had like security. They had cabinet meetings. They had hoarded all these guns. I mean, it was the level of organization is remarkable. And this is something that I'm convinced only Germans can do to this degree. The court actually showed signed Chatham House rule agreements that the members of this plot had to sign, basically swearing that they would not, they would abide by Chatham House rules for this one meeting. I mean,
Wow.
But on the one hand, very organized. On the other hand, totally loopy. I mean, the thing that these people believed in was that the deep state, the old story of the deep state, but that the deep state was illegitimate, and that there were foreign intelligence agencies, I mean, American, Russian, all kinds of intelligence agencies that actually were allies to this group and that were waiting to sort of support this group once it overthrew the German government. Then they had this whole cockamamie idea that there were like underground bases underneath Germany, and whoever made this up and sold it to them was actually quite funny, and named them the DUMB. It stands for like something like secret underground base, but it spells out dumb. And these guys believed in these dumbs, that there were like these underground bases. They paid people to find the entrance to these bases. So you have on the one hand this very sophisticated sort of leadership, organization, and all the sort of things that it takes to actually overthrow a state. On the other hand, this sort of just wacky sort of internet QAnon sort of belief system united in these men. And it's really interesting to see. And just briefly, there are three different proceedings. There's one around the prince, who looks great after 2 years of jails, like lost weight and looks like tanned and all that stuff. And then and these sort of older men and a woman who was a judge and also a member of parliament for the AfD. And then you have another group that sort of involves the younger sort of soldiers, probably the scarier guys when it comes to physical violence. And the third group that's starting now in Munich is sort of the group of supporters and people who are funding that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's ongoing.
So why why was the decision made to sort of separate it into the three different cases? Does it have to do with just the complexity of the charges against each of the different members of the group? Or I had read somewhere that it also has to do with security concerns of trying not to concentrate everything in one place. What's sort of the rationale for separating it?
I mean, there's several aspects to it, and of course, the security is one big one. For example, the case in Frankfurt, they built a temporary courtroom on the outskirts of Frankfurt just to house these. I think in that case, it's 10 or 9
I think it's
accused.
9, right? There's 9 in the first one.
And one died, I think. So one died of like some unrelated illness, and then while waiting for the trial. But anyway, just for these guys that are there, they each have 2 to 4 defense lawyers. So each one of the 9 has up to 4 defense lawyers. You have a panel of 5 judges, then you have 2 replacement judges, and you have all kinds of other players in the thing. There's a weird thing in German law is that judges, in order to judge, have to actually listen to all the testimony. So they can't just have a police officer saying, okay, he told me this and this is his signed testimony. They have to have the person say it again. So that makes these kind of trials really, really long, because if you have everybody sort of having to sort of answer, judge, I said this, you basically have to unroll all this sort of conspiratory sort of chatting and all this stuff that was going on. And that takes a really long time. And so I mean, the short answer is that the German legal system is just not set up for this kind of huge, for that many people in one trial. And actually, we looked into it on that level of trial. The last one that had that many people, or even close to that many people, were the Auschwitz trials in the 1960s, where all these Auschwitz commanders were tried under a special court under Fritz Bauer. I don't know if you quite a remarkable story, but that was the last time you had that many people at once sort of tried. Otherwise, you try to break apart the trials, and then you can kind of proceed.
And are the charges in each of these cases different? The ones around the prince and the older people versus the ones around the soldiers, or is it all the same sort of charges, more or less?
I mean, they're more or less, it's the same, but then there's specific sort of, tailor-made charges as well. So one of the guys in the big Stuttgart trial is actually, beyond everything else, is also being tried for, in the same court, attacking the police officers who came to arrest him. And he was sitting there with like some kind of a machine gun in his apartment, just shooting out of the door, and almost took off one of the police officers' the in this exchange. So on top of everything else, the conspiracy, the high treason, and all the other charges that are there, and having joined a terrorist organization, he's also being tried for this thing of actually shooting at police officers. But that's done in front of all the other defendants as well. So all the defendants and the lawyers are also sitting there while they take like 20 days to try him on this charge of I think it's I don't know if it's involuntary manslaughter or something, or attempted involuntary manslaughter, but it's like a trial to do with actually possibly killing one of those police officers.
And can you tell us a little bit more about sort of this character who's the ringleader, Heinrich Prinz Reuss? He seems like quite a character who kind of came out of nowhere. Does he really have this charisma to have pulled this group together?
I mean, I wouldn't say, from what I can see, he's not a crazy charismatic guy. But I think that these people with their conspiracy theories believe enough in this idea that actually only aristocrats can actually sign. Somebody told them that only an aristocrat can, or a royal or whatever, can sign these like peace treaties. So it was important for them to have one of these guys at the head as a symbolic head. It should be said that one of the guys who actually sort of started the whole thing is also out of an old aristocratic family, but he's not a prince, but he's like a fun whatever pescatore. So there's this sort of idea that these sort of blue bloods are more important. So having him at the center of everything, and it's interesting because I think that you just had two different interests sort of collide, because the people planning this coup wanted a guy like that, a prince that would make it sort of feel legitimate and all that stuff. And he had been sort of disgruntled over years. He'd been trying to get back lands that the family, his ancestors, had lost, first to the Nazis and then to the Communist Party, or actually I don't know whether the Nazis did, but anyway, the Communist Party did. So when the wall fell, there were all these lands that apparently once belonged to his family, and he spent years and a lot of money in court trying to get back some of this land. And I spoke to his cousin, who has the exact same name, because everybody in that family has the same name. It's interesting because there's like, I mean, if you ever don't want to be named after a guy, it's in this situation. But in this family, they're all called Prince Heinrich, but the number is different. And the number is some complicated thing. And they all have nicknames. So because all the Heinrichs have to be able to tell each other apart. And his cousin told me, that he had just for years tried. He was very disgruntled. And it seems to have sort of, I mean, lost the plot is maybe, making it sound not as serious as it was, but he was this disgruntled guy, and it seems even in the court proceedings, it seems that he was really after sort of getting back the lands and all these kind of things, and the other guys were into overthrowing the government, and that seemed maybe, I mean, he wanted to do it and he was part of it, but I think he really had his own motives there.
Mm-hmm. So you had talked about the fact that one of the people in this group is a former politician who represented the AfD. I think that there was another local politician, the Stadtrats, who also represented the AfD. But what I thought was really interesting was at first blush, it seemed as if this group really came from the far right. But it also seemed, as we started to find out more about it, that the group included some people who were from the Querdenker movement, or the lateral thinker movement, which one thinks of as being on the other end of the political spectrum, sort of at the far left, not necessarily at the far right. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more from you about kind of the makeup of the group. As you said, it included doctors, it included some very established people as well, and not, from all walks of life, if you will.
From all walks of life. And I think this is the problem we're having with some of this online stuff that happens, is that it's kind of hard to put them politically into a certain spot. I mean, definitely there were far right actors in there, but then there are other people who just kind of feel like there's a guy who had this big Telegram group that was like a QAnon, a German QAnon group, and while the old Reichsbürger were kind of known for being a far right and for some reason always anti-Semitic as well, it might not be the case with every one of these people sitting there. It might just be, I mean, the woman who was actually part of this Querdenker movement and who had actually run for a seat somewhere, I don't know, in the state legislature under the Querdenker party called, I think, Die Basis, if I'm not mistaken. They, she just seems like kind of this hippie, as you say, this like hippie, which is, talking about the vaccines, and she was like active on the Waldorf school, like parent teacher committee. So like not at all. And she's sitting next to like the elite soldier, who's just kind of totally dangerous. So it is a weird, and I think it's probably something you see in the United States as well, this kind of weird amalgam of different belief systems, and the thing that unites them is sort of like a hate or like a distrust of the actual government. Yeah.
So over the last, I mean, as we look at some of the different people in the group, I think it's particularly interesting to hear about some of the soldiers that were involved. As you said, some of them were, from elite groups within the military. And over the last few years, there's been some concern about radicalization within the Bundestag, within the Bundeswehr, some radicalization within the Bundeswehr, and that there have been concerns that there are these pockets of soldiers who share these thoughts. Can you talk at all about sort of how widespread it's thought this is within the Bundeswehr, and anything that the Bundeswehr might be doing to crack down on it?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's tough to get reporting on that because the Bundeswehr doesn't really give us much access. And a couple of years ago, we really looked into it around this elite soldier who would also pose as a Syrian refugee. Clearly, there is right-wing thought in the Bundeswehr, which is probably exacerbated in the special forces because there's this idea of like, German superiority, like these are like these dudes who are like the best of the best, and there's this sort of idea, and I think that the army in general, since it gave up the draft system, what is that now, 15 years ago, it has less of a representation of like all the people from all walks of life. It's now, people who really into the army, and then you kind of have to wonder why are you really into the army, or people who are looking for like career chances. Actually, a lot of people who are like have migratory backgrounds, as they say in Germany, like migrants to Germany, who are German citizens, but who like join it because they see it as a way, to get a good, good education and so forth. But of course, you also have these old boys who kind of, dream of like the old victories of the Wehrmacht. I mean, this has been like in the after the war, this was always the case when they rebuilt this thing, that you always had these sort of these ideas somehow that like the Wehrmacht, which is now the Bundeswehr, the German army, was so powerful. And there was even like, I don't know, 20 years ago, where they would go around, they would still find these old, pictures or songs. I mean, there is a right-wing element in there. I mean, we just don't have the numbers to know how much of it is that and how much of it are really professional people who don't have that at all, and how many people, join from other regions. It's a really interesting place, but it's sort of a black box to us who report on it.
Yeah.
And I really like reporting on the Bundeswehr, but I've just not been able to find that much.
So this, this sort of the raids on the Reichsbürger, and now the cases that we're seeing unfold are of course not the very first time that this has come up. I guess it was in August of 2020 that there was, an attempt to storm the Bundestag building. It was largely because of the COVID-19 restrictions, which you talked about a little bit earlier. It was led largely, or at least there were flags of the Reichsbürger that were present at the time. But that's something where the police cracked down on this very, very quickly, and nothing more happened. And I think some people forgot about it, so they were a little bit surprised then about these raids of the Reichsbürger, I guess about 18 months to 2 years later. How likely was it that this second attempt could have succeeded?
Let me just like make one thing clear. I know but just so everybody listening knows. So the Reichsbürger is a huge group of people. They say there's like 23,000 active members, and most experts think that the dark number is much higher. The people who climbed up onto the Reichstag in 2020, I was actually there that day. I was reporting. It was sort of like a mad group of people. Some of them were kind of like far right actors, some were AFDs, and it was sort of. But the push was one of the guys was this quite a famous YouTuber, this Nicholas Nerling, I think is the name, who calls himself the Volkslehrer, who does these like for the AFD, these kind of propagandist sort of videos. So it was a huge mix. These guys that got arrested then 18 months later, they could have been totally different people. They could have even been, it's conceivable that they could have seen that back then and said, oh no, that's not us, we're totally against this. Because it's like, it's so hard to pinpoint because it's such a big scene.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah.
There is also, to answer your question, I mean, the chances of something like this happening, I mean, there are these groups of Reichsbürger, and they're sort of separate from each other. There's another group that's in front of court, I think in Koblenz now, and it was kind of too low scale for us to cover it really, but they planned to kidnap the health minister, and this was to do directly with COVID, right? And they had like some crossbows, I think, but one of the guys who was in on these conversations was actually a what do you call, like a guy who was from the intelligence. He was like a, what do you call those guys? Anyway, and so so, you know, those guys got caught pretty quickly. But all this to say that there are different groups, and we can't say for sure like the danger is gone. I think it's very unlikely for a group to grow as large and sophisticated as these guys did without anybody on the outside finding out about it. I think this was really the tip of the iceberg in terms of, like, I'd be surprised if we'd find something else, but who knows, you know, within the structures of government, of army or something like that, you know, not within the army itself, but like sort of soldiers in their spare time, you could
Mhm.
see something like that happening. But this was so sophisticated in terms of planning that it just feels like this this would be hard to replicate.
So that leads to a question that one of our viewers just posed, which is what impact have these trials had on the public perception of the Reichsbürger movement in Germany?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think the thing that we all, so the subtext of these trials for reporters, for people watching this, was the question, were these guys actually dangerous? Like, could they have actually overthrown the state, or were they just a bunch of old fools, to, you know, put it that way? There's this, you know, people called it, especially people on the right, interestingly enough, called it what was it, like the Rentner Revolution or something, you know, like the
Right.
idea that it was just like a whole bunch of old crazy people.
Pensioners.
Pensioners, like the overthrow of the pensioners or the revolution of the pensioners, like this idea that they were all these just kind of old, slightly silly people. And so that's what we're watching now in these trials. It's this question, okay, and then there were some sort of irregularities with these raids, and there was a new interior minister, and she made sure that everybody knew that these raids were happening. So a lot of people said, well, that's kind of odd that you would have, you know, 800 cameras to be there when the prince was arrested, you know, if
Right.
this was such a scary thing. So um so it's a question we're still asking. I think, to be honest, that the Reichsbürger have kind of like diminished in stature since this has started, because they've just been sort of out of mind. Since then, we've had so many other crazy things happening. Since then, we've had, you know, the beginning of the war, or we've had the war, you know, in Ukraine, and we've had, as I mentioned to you before, you know, we've had a high-level intelligence officers selling secrets to Russia, and we've had two top AFD guys, who are charged, or not legally charged, but who are being investigated for getting money from Russia or getting money from China. So it's been such a crazy 2 years that these Reichsbürger almost seem quaint. But the question is still there. Were they really dangerous? Obviously, they were dangerous. Obviously, there were guns, like police officers for sure would have been killed. But were they actually a threat to democracy? I think most people say probably not.
Mhm.
But who knows?
Well, so in light of that, how does this group, right, the Reichsbürger themselves, but then also how do the trials impact the political landscape on the far right? Do they have any impact there at all?
I don't think so. I think because for the most part, these guys were not political for the most part. They weren't really part of the AFD. The AFD can kind of make fun of it and say, "Oh, look at the German state overreacting," blah blah blah. But it's not. I don't think AFD voters would be stopped by the Reichsbürger or by this sort of these trials, and I don't think people who don't vote for AFD would somehow, you know, link the two necessarily. I mean, it's telling that there was a sort of a Berlin election fiasco where we had to redo an election that we had. It was
Mhm.
in 2021. We had to redo it twice, once for the local elections and one, or state elections, one for the federal elections. And when they redid the federal election, the woman, the judge who was on trial and who was in prison at the time, got more votes. She still lost, but she got more votes that second time than she did originally,
Wow,
when it wasn't known that she was part of this plot.
wow,
So it means people, the AfD is not, I mean, I don't think they were like voting in support of her. I think people
right,
just don't care.
right. Yeah, one of our viewers asks that you talk a little bit more about the younger generation and whether you perceive sort of a shift to the right among younger voters, and specifically is curious about your reaction to a video that sort of made a lot of headlines of party goers on the northern German island of Sylt who were chanting racist tropes. And I guess this was this spring, right? It was May,
Yeah, it was just in May.
just a few weeks ago. That really got a lot of attention because it showed the next generation, and it showed some racist and anti-Semitic perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think what people saw inside of Germany watching that video was less about the age of the people and more about their social status. Sylt is like a very wealthy kind of destination, and this kind of party mecca for the well-heeled, and so why people were so shocked by this was that these were all sort of upper middle class kids, clearly, who were doing this. And it was less about the fact that they were young, I think, than it was the fact that, like, okay, well, even sort of like the wealthy, ruling class is doing this in their spare time and apparently not scared of being filmed. We have a problem. I think overall, I think the youth vote breaks down like every other age. You do have the far right, you still have, progressive kids, and especially in the big cities. I think this sort of idea that like the youth is going far right is wrong. We first had it when in 2021, when all of a sudden a lot of young people voted for the Free Liberals, the FDP, the Free Liberal Party, the Free Democratic Party, sorry. And people were sort of confused by that they got so many young people voting for them. But that was simply because the party sort of said, look, we can't have these pandemic restrictions forever, and we really have to stop them. And that appealed to a lot of young people who were just tired of being like locked indoors and going out. So I think we have to be a bit careful about this idea that there is a huge shift. But what has happened is that where 3 or 4 years ago, you had this huge wave of young Germans fighting against the climate crisis, this Fridays for Future, the Greta Thunberg, Germany was one of the most important countries in terms of numbers. And you had these big, Friday demonstrations where you had hundred thousands of kids marching, so that is gone. That's dissipated. You only have the sort of hardcore activists, and you have a lot of young people who've kind of stopped doing that. So for me, as interesting as sort of the fact that, quite a few, 16% or so of young people voted for the AfD, is the fact that so many stopped voting Greens.
Yeah.
That's it. And that's a totally different, question, but
yeah. So, we were talking a little bit about sort of the timeline of the different things that have happened, both on the side of the Reichsbürger, but then on the side of the security forces and security agencies on the government side that have really tried to tap down on it. One of our viewers is curious what sort of an impact the war in Ukraine has had on the Reichsbürger and on the timing of this. But I think an important sort of corollary to that is this a group that has received support from Moscow in the past? Are there any ties there that are known?
So one of the people on trial in Frankfurt is a Russian woman who is the life partner, I guess, of the prince. She also brings down the average age by about 60 years or so, because she's like 40 or something.
Okay.
And she apparently was trying to get a contact and had some meetings with the consul in Germany, the Russian consul. It doesn't look as though the Russians responded. It feels like the Russians are being, I mean, I'm just saying this, knowing very little about how the Russians are thinking, but from the 3 cases I know where people have tried to sell information to the Russians or tried to get them to get involved with these kind of things, the Russians have just, it's like they can just say they know these guys are crazies, and it's like there's not worth their time to get involved, which is interesting given all the other sort of meddling that they seem to be trying to do in Germany. But in this case, it sounds like they weren't involved, but we don't know this for sure. This is going to come out. It's one of the things we'll find out during the trial.
So, I mean, at this point, does it seem as if the threat of the Reichsbürger movement has been eliminated? Or, are we talking about just the tip of the iceberg with 27 people who are appearing in court cases, but really, as you said, thousands of supporters of the movement who are out there still in society. Are there still concerns that the Reichsbürger movement can implement some of what this group had in mind, or is there a sense of we've eliminated that threat?
I mean, I think there are concerns still, but I think the fact is that people are just more worried about other threats to democracy. They're more worried, they're less worried about people coming through the back door or somehow, taking over the parliament, and they're more worried about people being voted in. I mean, a lot of the people, these sort of millions who went out on the streets, and millions over months, was always a million people.
Yeah.
Those are people who are really worried that the AfD will win their way into the state houses and eventually the Bundestag. And that poses to, I mean, I think in many people's minds is much more dangerous than even 27 people who are armed.
So I have two more questions that sort of relate more to the trials themselves, and one is kind of trying to think ahead. Are there any potential long-term implications of these three trials for Germany's legal system, or for its political system? I mean, you had said that the last trials of this sort of size were in the 1960s.
I mean, I think there's one. I mean, I'm fascinated by the German court system. It's so archaic in some way. I would say this. I would say that there are some actually reforms underway that will move sort of the legal system a little bit. And one is, it's a weird one, but is the idea that like court proceedings can be recorded, because in Germany now you can't record. There's no like transcription of a court proceeding. You basically, it's up to the judge to take notes, or one of the judges there, and it makes it very difficult if there's ever like a retrial or anything like that. These ones are being recorded because it's basically for posterity. Or actually, I can't remember. I think there was a demand that they be recorded, and I think in one of the courts actually they overruled that, and they actually are not recording it. But there's certain very important trials that do get recorded for posterity, but then that doesn't get released till much after the verdict. I think that would be something. I don't think that this will have much of an effect on the legal system. I think the legal system is sort of slowly reforming itself, regardless of what's going on here. Politically, I think the one thing that there is sort of a stronger movement is to actually be maybe a little bit more cautious with sort of parliamentary security. They've started. I mean, German sort of post-war parliamentary sort of, or let's say post-fall of the wall parliamentary spirit is to be open and to have everything, access to everybody. Anyone who wants to visit these houses can get in and so forth. And I think there's starting to be, with this and some other problems that we've had, sort of like a realization like, oh, we do actually have to be a little bit more, worried about who gets access, who can come in, why are they there, can they always come in, all these kind of things. So I think there are some small kind of reforms. We had an interview the other day with the president of the parliament, and she said they're looking at these like ways of making the actual physical space more secure, and they're like building new in the basement. They're building like these new rooms that you can't bug. They're like bug-proof rooms with like these thick metal walls and stuff. Because they're starting to realize it's like people actually care what goes on in there, and they had better secure it.
Well, so that then ties into very nicely to sort of the final question I had for you, which is kind of what you would recommend people to watch, or what the things are that you're going to be looking for as these cases unfold. Obviously, there are lots of variables and lots of factors unfolding sort of at the same time and simultaneously. But what would you encourage people to pay attention to as these trials play out?
I mean, I think what sort of bears looking at, I find fascinating, is sort of and this is basically the answer, is like looking at some of the testimony of some of these people. how they became radicalized, how they came to this point where they were willing to sort of most of these guys are more or less like law-abiding citizens if you met them in a different context. Like, what makes somebody like this sort of old law-abiding German into somebody who's willing to actually overthrow the government or even think about it? That I think will be very interesting to hear from these different perspectives. Is, as we mentioned before, there's this funny magic that happened in this anti-pandemic, anti-corona movement that I think we still haven't fully kind of caught up to yet, where just these like otherwise rational people kind of just went off because they read somewhere that the mRNA vaccine that Pfizer was making was somehow going to tag them for life. And it's something that I kind of find fascinating, and that's something I'll be watching. I mean, obviously, one thing that's interesting and worth watching is that I think this crew of 27 that they have in court were actually, to some degree, fooled by one or two of the people in that group of 27. There was one guy who's in the Stuttgart court who said that he had links with these allies that were going to support them, and he kept on saying, "Oh, like, and they're not ready to do the day X now," and so forth. And that I find super interesting. There's these kind of con men who are within this structure and somehow just thought it was okay to lead people on. So that's something to watch how that unfolds, because I think we'll see that there were some real believers, and then there were people who just kind of opportunists who just kind of used it for themselves. There was two Swiss brothers who took something like 160,000 euros from this group to A, buy them weapons, but B, show them where the entrance to these dumb caves were, or underground structure. And they kept on, and you hear it in court, and they kept on paying them, and they said, "Oh, 30,000, we need another 20,000, to send people down there." And then at some point they said they had found something, and and it's just clearly kind of confidence tricksters, and these people who were like normal life, like established people, just totally fell for them.
Yeah, they seem quite gullible at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And then to your other point, that there were people who were sort of Trittbrettfahrer, right? People who were just along for the ride because they got swept up in this position perspective, even if they weren't completely convinced of it themselves. And I think that we did see some of that around anti-vaxxers. We saw some of that, certainly during the pandemic, when people were very upset with the rules and regulations that were constraining their lives. And this is, maybe part of the response, right? Maybe if the pandemic had not happened, we wouldn't have seen this attempt by the Reichsbürger to react at this time.
I think what you could definitely, I mean, definitely, you never say anything definitely, but what seems pretty clear to me is that some of those people would not have been part of it. There's some, like the soldiers, who knows, we might have seen them, even without the pandemic. But some of the other people, like the woman you mentioned who was like part of it, they definitely would not have been part of it. So it would have been like kind of less sort of broadly based in society and more just a right-wing kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, and for your reporting, of course, on this as well. I think everybody who's tuned in will look forward to seeing the next reports as these cases unfold, because it's certainly fascinating to watch what's happening. So herzlichen Dank.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and yeah, keep your eyes on our channel. As I said, I'm going to be heading down there to Munich on Tuesday, next Tuesday, but I'm not sure I'll write anything because we've done so much. So we're waiting to do something, a bigger piece that kind of looks at all of it.
There has to be something really worthwhile to report on, but we'll certainly keep our eyes out for that. Many thanks.
You're very welcome. Bye.